$1, that is how much the Canadian government sold the Hudson Bay Railway for in the 1990s. Not $1 million, not $1 billion, one single dollar to an American company called Omnitras that ran it into the ground and abandoned it when floods hit. The railway everyone dismissed as Canada's most spectacular infrastructure failure for 90 years. But what if I told you that same $1 railway just became the biggest threat to American logistics dominance in a century? That Mark Carney just invested $262 million to transform it into a trade corridor that bypasses U.S. ports entirely, and that American logistics companies are watching billions in guaranteed Canadian business disappear to a route they mocked as irrelevant. This is the story of the ultimate revenge, how Canada turned America's arrogance into their own strategic weapon. How one railway everyone wrote off just rewrote the rules of North American trade. But before we dive into this incredible transformation, if you appreciate analysis that uncovers the real power plays behind the headlines, hit that like button and subscribe for the stories that reshape the world. Tonight, we're showing you how a $1 sale became a $1 billion threat, why American ports are about to lose their Canadian monopoly forever, and how the railway that was supposed to be dead just delivered the most devastating blow to us trade dominance in decades. Let's start with the humiliation. The Hudson Bay Railway was supposed to be Canada's crown jewel, built in the 1920s and 30s to connect prairie grain directly to European markets through Churchill on the Arctic coast. The promise was revolutionary: bypass expensive American ports and the Panama Canal, ship directly across Hudson Bay and the Atlantic to Europe. It was an unmitigated disaster. The railway crossed some of the most punishing terrain in North America: permafrost that shifted seasonally, muskeg that swallowed entire track sections, extreme cold that cracked steel, flooding that washed out hundreds of kilometers. The maintenance costs were astronomical because crews were constantly repairing damage from ground movement and weather. By the 1990s, the federal government was desperate to get rid of it. They literally gave it away. Sold the railway and the port of Churchill to Omnitras, a private American company, for exactly $1. That tells you everything about how worthless everyone believed it had become. Omnitras made it worse: minimal investment, deferred maintenance, systematic neglect. When major flooding destroyed sections in 2017, they essentially walked away. The railway sat unusable for over a year. Churchill was completely cut off from surface transportation. The town that was supposed to anchor Canada's Arctic trade corridor became an isolated community depending on expensive air transport for basic supplies. Most people figured that was the end. The railway everyone knew was a mistake finally died the death it deserved. But in 2018, something unexpected happened. A consortium of 41 First Nations communities and northern Manitoba towns bought the railway and port. They called themselves Arctic Gateway Group. Most analysts saw it as a symbolic gesture: Indigenous ownership of infrastructure that had no commercial future. What nobody anticipated was that 5 years later, the strategic calculus would shift so dramatically that the railway everyone dismissed would suddenly become essential to Canadian independence. Enter Mark Carney. When Trump started threatening Canadian sovereignty, Carney didn't just see a trade dispute. He saw an opportunity to eliminate a century of American leverage over Canadian exports for generations. Western Canadian resources had one viable path to global markets: south through the United States. Grain went to American ports. Minerals traveled through American railways. Even shipments heading to Europe typically routed through American infrastructure because that is where the capacity existed. The United States collected fees at every transfer point. American logistics companies controlled scheduling, American ports determined priorities, and Canadian exporters paid premiums for the privilege of using infrastructure they didn't own and couldn't control. Carney looked at the Hudson Bay Railway that everyone had written off and saw something different: a direct route from the Canadian prairies to European markets, a corridor that could handle grain, fertilizer, critical minerals, and energy without touching American soil or paying American fees. In November 2025, Manitoba and the federal government announced $262 million to upgrade the Hudson Bay Railway to Class 1 standards. This isn't maintenance, this is complete reconstruction to the highest freight standards in North America. The breakthrough that makes this possible now when it failed for 90 years: technology. Arctic Gateway Group solved the permafrost problem with AI monitoring, ground, penetrating radar, and predictive maintenance that didn't exist when the railway was built. The result? The Hudson Bay Railway is now in the best condition in 30 years despite crossing terrain that destroyed previous track. So what moves on this upgraded railway that justifies $262 million and terrifies American logistics companies? Saskatchewan and Manitoba produce massive grain volumes. Currently, almost all goes through Vancouver or American ports. Churchill offers a significantly shorter route to European markets. With Class 1 standards, unit trains carrying thousands of tons can reach Churchill efficiently. Second, potash. Saskatchewan dominates global potash production. 95% goes to exports, mostly through American logistics networks. Every ton shipped through Churchill is a ton not generating fees for American infrastructure. Genesis Fertilizers has already signed agreements to route imports and exports through Churchill. Third, critical minerals. Northern Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec have massive deposits of nickel, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. Getting these to market has been prohibitively expensive due to infrastructure limitations. Churchill with Class 1 railway access changes the economics completely. Mine operators can ship directly to European refineries without routing through American facilities. Fourth, energy. The Port of Churchill Plus proposal includes an energy corridor potentially for liquefied natural gas, hydrogen, or electricity transmission. Alberta has proposed an energy corridor to Churchill. If built, Western Canadian energy reaches European and Asian markets without touching American infrastructure. Add it up, and you are looking at tens of millions of tons annually flowing through infrastructure that completely bypasses American control. Chris Avery, Arctic Gateway Group CEO, stated explicitly, "We're setting the stage for a new era that unlocks the trade and transportation potential of Canada's Arctic Trade Corridor to serve the Canadian national interest. Not regional development, national interest. This is infrastructure with strategic purpose. The economics are devastating for American logistics." For decades, Western Canadian exporters had no real alternative to southern routes. You wanted to move large volumes to global markets. You used American infrastructure and paid American fees. Churchill eliminates that monopoly. Saskatchewan grain producers can now choose: ship through American ports and pay their premiums, or route through Churchill with shorter distances to Europe and no American intermediaries. Manitoba fertilizer companies can import through Churchill instead of American ports. Alberta Energy potentially reaches markets through Hudson Bay instead of American export terminals. Every ton that shifts to Churchill is revenue American companies no longer collect: port fees, railway charges, logistics premiums, storage costs. The entire American transportation industry in border states has profited from Canadian dependence for over a century. That profit stream is about to diminish substantially, and there is nothing the United States can do to prevent it. This isn't a tariff Canada can retaliate against. It is not a trade dispute America can bring to arbitration. It is simply Canada investing in its own infrastructure and choosing to route Canadian products through Canadian territory. Trump can threaten all he wants, but he can't stop a railway upgrade in Manitoba. He can't prevent grain from shipping through Churchill. He can't force Canadian companies to use American logistics networks if they have better alternatives. The irony is perfect. Climate change, which has been destabilizing permafrost, is also extending the shipping season through Hudson Bay. Churchill historically operated 4 months. Now it is approaching 5 or 6 months, with icebreaker support potentially enabling year-round operations. What was marginally viable 90 years ago is genuinely competitive today. This is about more than railways and ports. It is about Canada demonstrating that American infrastructure isn't indispensable. For generations, Western Canadian exports depended on American routes because no alternatives existed. That dependence gave the United States leverage. Trump's threats didn't make Canada weaker. They made alternatives economically compelling. Investing $262 million in a railway through muskeg and permafrost looks crazy, until you realize it eliminates billions in payments to American logistics companies and removes American leverage over Canadian trade. Every grain shipment through Churchill instead of American ports is proof that Canadian companies can function independently. Every mineral export that bypasses American refineries demonstrates that supply chains can work without American intermediation. And this isn't just Canada. Other countries are watching. If Canada can successfully build trade infrastructure that bypasses American control, why can't they? The precedent matters far beyond this specific railway. American logistics companies in border states are watching the tonnage projections and doing the math. The grain that used to flow south, the minerals that used to route through American facilities, the fees and charges that added up to billions annually. All of it potentially shifting to a railway that runs north to Churchill and then directly across the ocean to European markets. The Hudson Bay Railway that America dismissed, neglected, and eventually sold for $1 is becoming the corridor that proves Canadian independence isn't just rhetoric. It is infrastructure being built, operated, and used to move billions in trade without American permission. From a $1 sale to a $1 billion threat, from America's discarded asset to Canada's strategic weapon. From 90 years of failure to the route that just changed everything. Trump wanted to demonstrate that Canada had nowhere else to go. Instead, he gave Canada the motivation to go north, to invest in infrastructure that everyone knew existed, but nobody thought was worth making functional. $262 million buys more than railway upgrades. It buys optionality, strategic independence, and the ability to choose routes based on economics rather than necessity. And there is nothing Washington can do except watch the trade they assumed was locked in place, find a different route. The railway America sold for $1 just became their billion-dollar nightmare, and the revenge is only beginning. The human cost of American arrogance is already showing. Consider Fargo, North Dakota, where grain elevators that processed Canadian wheat for decades are cutting staff. Minneapolis logistics firms that coordinated Canadian shipments are losing contracts. Duluth port workers who loaded Canadian potash onto Great Lakes freighters are facing reduced hours. Buffalo railway yards that transferred Canadian goods are operating with skeleton crews. These aren't abstract economic statistics. These are American workers losing jobs because their government thought bullying Canada had no consequences. Small border towns that built entire economies around Canadian trade dependence are watching their main revenue source disappear to a railway line they never saw coming. The speed of the shift is what makes it devastating. Railway infrastructure takes decades to build, but once operational, trade patterns can change in months. A Saskatchewan grain elevator that is shipped through Minneapolis for 50 years can redirect to Churchill in a single harvest season. A Manitoba potash mine that has used North Dakota railways for generations can switch to Hudson Bay routes with one contract revision. American logistics executives are scrambling to offer discounts, negotiate long-term deals, anything to keep Canadian shippers from exploring northern alternatives, but they're competing against geography and mathematics. The distance from Winnipeg to European markets through Churchill is simply shorter than routes through American ports. No amount of negotiation changes that fundamental reality, and the technological advantage is permanent. The AI monitoring systems, predictive maintenance protocols, and permafrost stabilization techniques that make the Hudson Bay Railway viable now represent a generational leap forward. American infrastructure built in the 1950s and 60s can't match the efficiency of railway systems designed with 21st century technology from the ground up. The psychological impact may be more damaging than the economic losses. For over a century, American policymakers assumed Canadian resource dependence was permanent, that geography and infrastructure requirements made alternatives impossible. The Hudson Bay Railway proves that assumption catastrophically wrong. If Canada can successfully reroute its Western exports away from American control, every other American ally is taking notes. Mexico watching grain shipments bypass Texas ports, European nations seeing critical minerals reach markets without American intermediation, Asian countries recognizing that trade routes don't have to run through American-controlled infrastructure. The precedent terrifies Washington strategists who built foreign policy around the assumption that global trade ultimately depended on American infrastructure, American logistics, American control of key choke points. The Hudson Bay Railway demonstrates that determined allies can engineer around American leverage entirely. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of this revenge story is the timing. Right when Trump thought he'd maximize pressure on Canada, right when American negotiators believed they held all the cards, Canada quietly activated infrastructure that makes American threats irrelevant. The railway upgrade announcements came not as dramatic confrontation, but as routine infrastructure investment. No speeches, no ultimatums, just $262 million in funding that restructures continental trade. American officials who dismissed the Hudson Bay Railway as a perpetual money pit now have to explain to border state senators why billions in Canadian business is flowing to a route they never considered a threat. The same logistics experts who mocked Indigenous railway ownership are watching First Nations communities control infrastructure that is reshaping North American commerce. From a $1 sale that symbolized American dismissal of Canadian alternatives to a billion-dollar trade corridor that proves those alternatives were always possible. From 90 years of spectacular failure to the success story that just rewrote the rules of continental commerce, the railway that America threw away just became the route that threw America away. And every grain train heading north to Churchill carries the message, underestimate Canada at your own peril.